My name is Katie Eisel, and I'm a photography major here at the College of Visual Arts. The title of my thesis is The Boiling Frog Theory, Defining Sexual Assault. I'm going to be talking about the flaws in society's definitions of sexual assault and sexual harassment and how they contribute to rape culture. If you're wondering about my title, it's from a quote from Jacqueline Friedman. Just to summarize it, the basic point of it is that if you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, it will immediately jump out. But if you put a frog in a pot of room temperature water and heat it to a boil, the frog will stay in the pot until it eventually dies. This is an analogy for the way that girls grow up in society. We're exposed to all these very minor forms of sexual harassment throughout all of our lives until we reach this point where we're adults and we're experiencing pretty severe acts of assault and harassment. And we don't even realize it because we've just kind of been assimilated into that culture. There are a lot of everyday occurrences that are deemed as normal that I believe should be considered negative and that I believe should be considered sexual harassment. So the goal of my thesis is to help people start to recognize some of these situations as negative. Some of this starts in our sex education in middle school and high school. We're taught that no means no. We're given reasons to give those who don't listen to the word no. And really what we're taught is that we're really only taught about rape and being physically forced into acts. We're not really talked to about the really subtle things that happen every day. We're also taught that rapists are going to be few and far between and that they're going to be strangers on the street and that we can avoid them by following some rules. And this really isn't true. By and large, if we are going to be assaulted, it's going to be by someone that we know and someone that we're close to. My own experience with this and with kind of finding out that certain things are sexual harassment. When I was 15 years old, I was dating someone who was 3 years older than me. And he never physically forced me into anything. We never had intercourse. But he never listened to the word no. He always asked why. And I would give him reasons and give him more reasons. And eventually I would get tired of giving him reasons and tired of telling him no. And I would give in. About a year ago, I heard the phrase, coercion is not consent. And that's when I realized, oh, hey, that wasn't okay. I had never actually really consented to that. So that's my own personal experience of going through something like this, that the kind of things that I'm talking about today. I've mentioned the term rape culture a couple of times. A lot of people are growing more familiar with the term, but if you haven't heard it, what it means is that sexual violence is normalized and accepted and sometimes even promoted in society today. The example image that I have here is from the Steubenville rape case. If you haven't heard about that case, it's the summary of the story is that a 16-year-old girl was raped and assaulted while she was unconscious at a party. And the boys that did it took images of what they were doing, posted them online, tweeted about it. It was all over their own social media profiles. Because it was all over the internet, the case went viral, and the boys were recently convicted. I believe two boys were convicted. One received a year and one received 2 years. This image here is of two boys protesting the fact that these boys were committed for the rape that they had committed. While it may seem extreme for someone to do this, maybe going out on the street is extreme, but if you had checked any social media sites of people from the surrounding area or even just people across the nation, there were a lot of people posting about this wasn't fair, they didn't give those boys a chance. People talking about how, yeah, they shouldn't have posted that stuff on the internet, but people not talking about they shouldn't have raped this girl. As far as statistics go, 1 in 4 women will be raped or assaulted in their lifetime. This statistic is also used when talking about assault, and sometimes it'll be a similar one, like 1 in 5 or 1 in 6, even less. I find that this statistic is very flawed, and I believe that's because the definitions of sexual harassment and assault are flawed in society. I want to know, if only 1 in 4 of us are going to be assaulted, why does every woman walk around following all these rules so that she can avoid being assaulted? So like I said, women follow a lot of rules to try and avoid being attacked or assaulted. We'll make sure that we're not walking on certain streets at night, make sure to carry our keys between our fingers, make sure to have a phone close at hand, but not be on our phone, because if we're on our phone, we're not aware. As soon as someone breaks one of these rules, if they are attacked, the victim becomes blamed. They are at least in part at fault. This is known as victim blaming, and it's one of the more common aspects of rape culture, one of the more well-known ones. If you've heard of the Slut Walk, that's a march that protests victim blaming specifically. And it's a very, very real thing. There was one study where 72 people were given various stories of rape and asked to rate how much blame should fall on the victim for each story. And regardless of the gender of the person rating the story, and regardless of the gender of the person in the story, the victim was always at fault, at least in part. While we're given these rules to avoid rape, we're also taught that other forms of sexual harassment are normal and okay. The example that I have here is from the media. It's Barney from How I Met Your Mother. If you haven't seen the show, his character is just a womanizing asshole. He goes after women. He has a scale of attractiveness, and if a woman doesn't meet a certain level of attractiveness, he will not associate with her. And if they do meet that level of attractiveness, he will do whatever he can to sleep with them. He'll trick them into sleeping with him. He'll completely ignore any slaps, drinks thrown in his face, or just the simple word no. A lot of people really, really love Barney and his character, and he's actually one of the favorite characters on the show for a lot of people, I think, which really shows how problematic he is. His character is shown as kind of just a comedic relief part of the show. His friends don't really reprimand him for anything he does. He's just kind of funny, and in reality his actions are problematic, and there are a lot of men that act this way. Another example in the media, if you haven't heard of the documentary, This Film Is Not Yet Rated, it's about the rating system for films and how films receive their G, PG, PG-13 ratings, etc. One of the first points that the film makes is talking about R versus NC-17 ratings. And it's actually easier for a film that contains a scene of rape to receive an R rating and be shown in widespread theaters than it is for a movie that contains a scene of a woman receiving sexual pleasure, especially if that pleasure is consensual, if the man is not receiving pleasure, so in the case of like oral sex, or if a woman achieves orgasm during the scene. So Blue Valentine and Black Swan are the examples I have on the bottom. Both movies had to fight to get knocked down to an R rating instead of NC-17 so that they could be shown across the country. Black Swan features a scene involving two women, one performing oral sex on the other, and Blue Valentine is a man and a woman, the man performing oral sex on the woman, and the woman does achieve orgasm during that scene. Clockwork Orange, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and The Last House on the Left, on the other hand, all very popular films, all containing a scene of graphic rape, and none of them had to fight for their R ratings. While we're taught how men are expected to act and how we should expect to be treated, we're also taught how to react as women. We're taught to be kind and complacent, and we're taught to take everything as a compliment. Especially if a man does not react violently to our no response. It's not uncommon for a man to react violently and go from, oh, you're so pretty, to, oh, you're such a bitch, you're ugly anyway. And if they don't do that, people are like, well, why couldn't you just take the compliment? One really common example of this is a woman going into a nightclub. When we go into a nightclub, we expect to be touched by a man we don't know. And the way that it usually happens is we're dancing in a group of friends and a man comes up behind us and without saying a word, we'll start touching our bodies or grinding against us. And for the most part, women will not turn around and push the man away. A lot of times they'll ask their friends to pull them away, or they'll make up an excuse like, oh, I need to go get a drink or something. And that's just how we're taught to handle things. We're not meant to turn around and tell this guy off for touching us when we never consented to it. So this is the first of my images that you'll be seeing, and that's based on that scenario. The goal of my work is to show these normal situations in a negative light. One problem that I came up against with this work was that I really don't want to show men as the villains, and I know I'm mentioning men do this and men do that. That does not apply to all men, and I recognize that. And the other thing is that we do live in a male-dominated society, so I do need men on my side in this. Even if all of the women in the world understand this and fight against it, we might not get anywhere without the help of men. So I really need men to be interested in this project, which is why I chose to go with the use of hands in images rather than an actual person as the attacker. In some images, the hands are projected to reference the idea that sometimes it's not actual touch, sometimes it is verbal, but that can be just as damaging. I also did incorporate one example of a woman perpetuating the problem. This image represents that time during high school and middle school when girls start to develop breasts and start to go through puberty, and all of their female friends are going through the same thing, so I have the same parts, so I'm entitled to touch yours. It happens a lot. There's usually not any consent between two high school girls. There's not any, hey, is it okay if I poke your boob? It just happens. And that is really problematic. Even if not everyone is negatively affected by that, some people are affected for years. I also chose to use myself in each image. I was going to be trying to incorporate different types of women in each image, try and kind of use each different type of woman that I could, but that really gets to be pretty extensive, and I don't honestly understand the experiences of a lot of women because I am a white, generally pretty thin young woman. I don't know what it's like to be an overweight woman and deal with this. I don't know what it's like to be a woman of color and deal with this. So I chose to use myself in hopes that rather than trying to create an image for each person to identify with, that I could almost be just a symbol and I could be replaced with any woman by using myself in each. Each image is also based on someone's personal experiences. I also used a lot of blogging websites to research other people's personal stories and find out which ones were really the most common. So I tried to pick scenarios that a lot of women have experienced so that a lot of people would be able to relate to this. And I'm also focusing on the spaces that we consider safe or spaces that we expect other forms of harassment to happen in. So safe spaces would be the home or the school. We don't expect anything to happen in those, but it does happen a lot. And then the nightclub, a lot of people go to nightclubs expecting like they're gonna have to watch their drinks and make sure no one puts anything in them and make sure they don't go home with the wrong person. But we don't go into nightclubs warned about someone's gonna touch you. Like if we are, it's just kind of like here's a fact. It's not a warning really. So this final image here represents my own experience with my ex-boyfriend that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. And I found this important to include because there are many women who are like me who don't realize that they have been assaulted until years later, or maybe still don't realize. There are also men and women who don't realize that they have assaulted people. It's very important that our definitions change to help eliminate the fact that sexual violence is so normal in our society. And I'm hoping that my images will help people start to see the normal as negative. Thank you. Any questions?
I'd like to say, as a man, that I'm glad that you pointed out that you weren't attacking men, but you were just trying to explain what is happening to women, and that as a man that I should understand this and make sure that I'm helping also. That's very important to include. I know that we mentioned it before. I'm glad that you touched on that.
What, if any, do you find the father's role, how important that is within the bringing up of a young lady and how that affects how things transpire and empowers you in that manner?
I guess I would say a big part of that is watching how a father treats women that he's with, regardless of if the father is married or not, because that is going to be a huge influence on the relationships that a girl is going to have and how she's going to react to men treating her. I guess that would be the biggest influence in my mind.
What you said about the film ratings was really interesting and not something that I've heard before. It's so interesting because the female orgasm is this sort of quiet thing. We don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And I thought that it was, would you ever consider doing a series on female pleasure? And like, if you did, how would you, I don't know, because the use of hands too is so interesting, and I don't know. Yeah, I guess that was more kind of like a comment / observation. Yeah, you're really awesome.
Yeah, that is actually one of the things that I looked into while I was doing this project, because I did start out looking at rape culture as like a whole, on a really broad spectrum, and that is one thing that I looked at was kind of how Men's sexuality is really open, and we do talk about that a lot, and we don't really talk about women's sexuality, and it's made out to be like, oh, it's so hard to figure out a woman's vagina. We don't know how to do this. Like, and it's true, it is. Like, there's so many things online about, like, there's one image that comes to mind of a woman holding a Rubik's Cube, and she's nude, and it's just from, like, the waist to mid-thigh, and she's holding it in front of her vulva, and people are reblogging it like, oh, this is the Rubik's Cube of the body, and it's like, it's not. We just don't learn about it. So that's definitely something that I did look into, and I'd be interested in looking into in the future.
Did you look into other cultures too, or was it mainly just Western culture in this particular project?
I did just stick with Western culture because that is what I know. I was, like I said, I was looking at examining the experiences of women of color and also transgender women and trying to encompass everything, but I realized that I really can't do that because that's not my place to speak for. So I chose to go with what I know and what I've experienced.
Is there titles for these pieces?
Yeah, there are. They're all based on either something that would be said in the situation or something that might be thought by the person being attacked. So this one is I Just Wanted to Watch a Movie. I can go back through. This one is If You Can Have Your Stuff If You Give Me a Kiss, which was based on a story that my mom told me. This one is Well, We Have the Same Parts, Why Does It Matter? This one is It's Not My Fault You're Pretty, which is based on an experience that I read online. And this one is Well, I Guess I Should Expect That.
How come it's always you in the pictures?
I chose to use myself so that I could kind of be a symbol for all the women because I was going to try and represent different women and have like the women that had the experiences in the images. But it was something that we talked about in critique and turning to using myself as a symbol so that I could just represent everyone as a whole rather than trying to represent so many different types of women who might have experienced these things.
You familiar with the film Hard Candy?
Yes.
Yeah, it's been themes in this obviously for me.
Mm-hmm.
I guess do you feel like that's like films like that are like liberating then? Or I mean like, you know, should there be more films that are, you know, that the role is like turned like that?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind seeing more like that. I really enjoy that film. So I guess I didn't really look, I would like to look into some analysis of that and see how it affects it as well.
You mentioned normal and negative with something you said a couple times. Is that a mindful rhetoric? Do you find it more effective in addressing a situation rather than some of the arguments involve setting misogyny or rape culture as subsets of white Western culture? Do you find that that's a stronger way of trying to express the argument by using the normal as negative?
Yeah, I guess that it just, for me, it kind of like stuck in my mind, and I guess I was kind of hoping that maybe repeating that throughout and having something with that alliteration would help. Yeah.
Well, just to dovetail that, I mean, I think that the language there really sort of addresses the sort of systemic nature of it, and that it's, you know, embedded within the systems of our culture. You know, the way that you addressed, you know, media, popular media, is a sort of perpetuation of certain perceptions and attitudes, and so I think it, you know, it takes a lot of courage to make work like this, and it certainly is the sort of tip of the iceberg. You know, speaking of the sort of systemic nature, the problem is I'd love to see take this project into like a military context and do the same piece with that demographic of people.
Yeah, and that's also something that I looked into and just didn't end up including because of the
Yeah,
trying to keep it
next
down.
body work.
Yeah, definitely.
Can you go into a little bit more about sort of the age when this starts, when you're like a young child on the playground, or because I know you talked to me a little bit about sort of like reiterating the normal is negative, sort of where you were exposed to this.
Yeah, and that was one direction that I looked at going in as well, was looking at where these experiences start to happen when we're really young. And one of the biggest examples is when you're really young and you're on the playground and a boy pushes you down and someone says, well, that just means he likes you. And we're kind of like, from a very, very young age, we start hearing that a boy hurting us or pushing us down or teasing us means that he likes us. And it's always justified with boys will be boys, so boys are just allowed to act that way. So that is one direction that I looked at going. I just didn't really end up elaborating on it because I decided to focus more on, I guess, current experiences that I'm having in like my age group right now. But yes.